Advaita Siddhi. Advaita Siddhi. There is a particular kind of book that does not merely describe reality but argues for it systematically, relentlessly, and with something close to fury. The Advaita Siddhi is one of those books. It was written in the 16th century, most likely around 1540, by Madhusudana Sarasvati, a philosopher about whose biography we know very little, but whose argument has never been successfully overturned. He wrote it as a direct response to the most sophisticated defense of dualism ever constructed, a text by the Advaita school that had methodically dismantled the classical Advaita position. Madhusudana's answer was not theological. It was architectural. He built a fortress of logic around the ancient Vedantic claim that what you call yourself and what the universe calls its ground are not two different things. The text that follows moves through 12 phases of that argument, from the opening invocation all the way to the final seal. It is dense, it is relentless, and it is addressed to you. Here now is the Advaita Siddhi, the fortress of identity. Phase 1. The Siege of Duality. The Invocation. The Advaita Siddhi opens with a Sanskrit verse saluting Krishna, the dark-complexioned child who played in the house of Nanda, as the supreme Brahman whose nature is pure, undivided awareness. What follows is a rendering of its spirit rather than a word-for-word translation, offered so that the argument ahead can be heard in the voice it was written in. I bow to that supreme Brahman, the unbroken mass of joy and light, who appeared as the dark child in Nanda's house and played among the ordinary things of the world without ever ceasing to be the ground of all of them. By the grace of that one reality, the manyness of the world is seen for what it is, a phantom sustained by ignorance, and the non-dual truth is established without remainder. The Declaration of War. The dualist has launched a siege. He uses the tools of common sense and careful inference to argue that the world is absolutely real, that difference is the truth, and that the soul is a creature permanently separate from the God who made it. I write this Advaita Siddhi to meet that argument on its own ground. I will take the dualist's weapons, the logic of perception, the logic of difference, the logic of causal reality, and I will break them one by one against the testimony of the Upanishads. I will prove, with systematic and unshakable reasoning, that Brahman is the only reality, and the world as an independent substance is a temporary appearance resting on no foundation of its own. What is at stake if the dualist is right? If difference is the final truth, then you are a finite creature. If you are finite, you are subject to the laws of time. If you are subject to time, you will suffer, you will diminish, and you will end. To accept duality as the last word is not merely a philosophical position. It is a sentence. This text is written to challenge that sentence with every instrument of logic available to a careful mind. To win the argument, we must first say precisely what we mean when we claim the world is false. Madhusudana does not say the world is nothing, the way a square circle is nothing. He says the world is mithya, false in a specific and technical sense that the next phase of the argument will define with care. The world is seen, it is experienced, it has weight and heat and texture, but it has no independent substance. It borrows its being from what it appears in, the way a mirage borrows the shimmer of the sun from the desert that supports it. We do not destroy the world by saying this. We destroy the mistaken belief in the world's self-sufficiency. When that belief is dissolved, what remains is not nothing. What remains is the Atman, the single ground that was always already there. The fortress is built, the gates are locked, the argument begins. Phase 2. The 5 definitions of falsity. The dualist stands at the gate and makes the obvious objection. If the world were false, it would simply not appear. A square circle does not appear. The son of a barren woman does not appear, but the world does appear. It appears with extraordinary vividness and with causal force. Therefore the world must be real. You cannot simultaneously say something appears and say it is false. This is exactly the confusion the 5 definitions are designed to dissolve. Mithya does not mean non-existent. It means something precise and technical, and each of the 5 definitions carves that precision from a different angle. The first definition, falsity, is the property of being different from both the absolutely real and the absolutely unreal. The absolutely real is Brahman, that which is never sublated, never cancelled by any subsequent experience, never dependent on anything outside itself. The absolutely unreal is the square circle, that which never appears under any conditions whatsoever. The world fits neither category. It is not like Brahman, because it is sublated when knowledge arises. It is not like the square circle, because it plainly does appear. It belongs to a third category, a vivid and causally forceful appearance that nevertheless cannot claim the permanence that alone would qualify it as ultimately real. The second definition, falsity, is the state of being absolutely non-existent in the very locus where it appears. Look carefully at the classic case. When a traveler sees a snake coiled on the path, the snake appears to exist in a particular place, in the rope lying on the ground. But even while the traveler is recoiling in fear, the snake has no existence in the rope across any of the 3 times, past, present, or future. It never was in the rope. It never will be in the rope. It is not in the rope now, even now while it is being seen there. The world appears in Brahman, but Brahman never actually became the world. The appearance does not alter the substrate. The third definition, falsity, is what is removable by knowledge of the substrate. The snake is removed the moment the traveler looks more carefully and sees rope. Not moved to another location, cancelled. Any appearance that is cancelled by knowledge of what it appears in was not genuinely present there. This is the difference between moving a stone and dissolving a shadow. The fourth definition is the one that requires the most care, because it is the most technically precise. Madhusudana states it using the apparatus of Navya-Nyaya logic, the formal system of inference that was the cutting edge of Indian philosophical analysis in his time. Falsity is defined as being the counterpositive of an absolute non-existence that is delimited by the thing's own locus. In the Navya-Nyaya vocabulary, pratyajita refers to the property of being a counterpositive, the correlate that stands on the other side of a relation of absence. Avakadaka refers to the delimiter, the property that specifies which absence we are talking about. What Madhusudana is saying in that precise language is this: the world is the kind of thing whose non-existence, properly delimited by Brahman as its locus, is an absolute and unconditional non-existence. This is not the ordinary absence of a pot in a room where the pot happens not to be. It is the stronger claim that the world, taken as a substance independent of Brahman, has a form of non-existence that holds without exception across all conditions. The fifth definition sharpens the fourth by specifying the scope of the non-existence involved. Falsity is being the counterpositive of an absolute non-existence that is not limited by any particular time, place, or individuating condition. The ordinary absence of a pot on a table is bounded. The pot is absent here, but present elsewhere. The non-existence of the world as independent substance is unbounded in this way. There is no place, time, or condition in which the world exists as a genuinely separate reality apart from Brahman. The boundlessness of the non-existence is precisely what distinguishes mithya from ordinary contingent absence. These 5 definitions are not 5 ways of saying the same thing loosely. They attack the problem from 5 distinct logical angles, from the standpoint of category, of locus, of defeasibility, of the formal structure of absence, and of the scope conditions of that absence. Together, they give the concept of mithya a logical articulation that is immune to the dualist's simple objection that what appears must be real. Something can appear with full force and still be mithya in all 5 of these senses simultaneously. The world does. The surgery is complete. Now we must investigate the ground on which the phantom dances. Phase 3. The substratum of the mirage. The dualist argues, when I see a jar, I experience its existence directly. That existence feels like a property of the jar itself. If the jar's existence were borrowed from somewhere else, I would have 2 distinct experiences, a jar experience and a separate existence experience. But I have only one. Therefore existence belongs to the jar is real, and the world is real. The argument is clean, the response is cleaner. You are not having 2 experiences, you are having one experience in which 2 things have been fused by ignorance into what appears to be one. An illusion cannot float in empty space, it must appear in something. A snake requires a rope. A mirage requires a desert. A face in the mirror requires a mirror. The law of the substratum states that every false appearance must rest on a real foundation, and the real foundation is precisely what lends the appearance, whatever being it seems to possess. Look at cognition across cases. The pot exists, the cloth exists, the tree exists. The pot and the cloth and the tree are variable, they change, they age, they break, they disappear, but the exists is invariant. In every perception of every object across every moment of experience, the exists does not change its character. It is the single thread on which the shifting beads of objects are strung. That unchanging thread is not a property of the beads. The beads borrow their appearance of solidity from the thread. In every perception there is a mixture. The real element is pure existence, sat, which is the nature of Brahman. The false element is the particular name and form, pot, cloth, tree. Ignorance is the mechanism that fuses these 2, causing the existence of Brahman to appear as if it belonged to the pot, and causing the finitude of the pot to appear as if it threatened the existence. When knowledge rises, the fusion is broken. The existence is restored to its source. The particular name and form is seen as the superimposition it always was. This is not nihilism. The claim is not that the pot is absolutely nothing. The claim is more precise. The pot's existence is real, and that existence is Brahman. The pot as an independently existing entity is the mithya superimposition. just as a man watching a wave does not watch two things, water and a separate wave substance, but only water taking a temporary shape. The perceiver of the jar is perceiving only Brahman taking a temporary appearance of jarness. Brahman is so overwhelmingly real that even his shadows appear solid. The density of the mirage is a measure of the intensity of the light that casts it. Why not then say everything is void and leave it at that? Because a void cannot support an appearance. If there were no rope, there would be nothing to misidentify as a snake. The very richness and persistence of the world's appearance is evidence not of the world's independent reality, but of the inexhaustible being of Brahman in which the world appears. We have found the desert. Now we must take the knife to the most fundamental delusion the desert supports, the appearance of difference itself. Phase 4. The murder of difference. The dualist makes what seems like the most obvious point in the world. I see a jar and I see a cloth. They are different. The jar has a certain shape and the cloth has a different one. This difference is not in my mind. It is an objective property of the things themselves. If everything were one substance, I would not see distinct borders. The fact that I do see borders is the most immediate and irresistible evidence that duality is real. We do not simply assert oneness in reply. We prove that the concept of difference cannot survive its own definition. The laboratory question is precise. What exactly is difference? When we say the jar is different from the cloth, what is the logical structure of that statement? Consider the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose difference is the very nature of the jar, not a quality it has, but what it essentially is. Then to know the jar at all, you must already know difference. But difference is always difference from something else. The jar is different from the cloth. Therefore you cannot know the jar's difference without already knowing the cloth. But by the same logic, you cannot know the cloth without already knowing its difference from the jar. Each term requires the other for its definition, and neither has any prior purchase. You are attempting to build a staircase where each step is supported only by the step above it. The entire structure hangs in the air. Consider the second horn. Suppose difference is not the jar's nature, but a quality that sits on the jar, the way color sits on a surface. Then that quality of difference is itself a thing. Is it the same as the jar or different from it? If it is different from the jar, then you need a second difference to connect the first difference to the jar. And you need a third difference to connect the second to the first. And so on without end. You have set in motion an infinite regress, an engine that must run forever and never reaches its destination. Any logical theory that requires an actually infinite number of steps to establish a single fact about a single jar is not a theory of the world. It is a description of a mind that has lost its footing. What this analysis reveals is that difference is not a stable object of knowledge. It is a relation that cannot ground itself. Every attempt to pin it down reveals that it depends on something else, which depends on something else. The borders you see between the jar and the cloth are real as appearances. They are not real as metaphysical cuts in the fabric of being. They are like the borders between waves on the ocean, meaningful as descriptions of surface patterns, but not marking any genuine separation in the water itself. When the logic of difference is shown to be self-undermining, the many does not vanish into nothing. What vanishes is the belief that the many is the final story. The isness of the jar and the isness of the cloth, once stripped of the phantom wall between them, are seen to be the same substance shining in two locations. The dualist counts borders. The Advaitin sees the light in which the borders appear and dissolve. Phase 5. The architecture of ignorance. The dualist challenges, you say the world is caused by ignorance, but ignorance, taken at face value, is simply not knowing something. It is a lack, an absence, a gap. How can a gap produce a galaxy? How can the absence of knowledge generate the physical weight of mountains and the heat of the sun? You are asking a nothing to do something, and that is incoherent. This objection rests on a misconstrual of what Madhusudana means by ignorance, avidya. In the Advaita Siddhi, avidya is not a mere lack. It is a positive entity, a positive something that functions as the material cause of the world. It is not the absence of a lamp. It is the darkness itself, understood as a thick positive presence that veils and distorts. This needs to be established before the architecture can be inspected. How do we know ignorance is positive rather than merely a gap? The argument from deep sleep. When a person wakes from a dreamless sleep, they report, "I knew nothing, and I was happy." This is a memory. Memory requires a prior experience of what is being remembered. The person is remembering a state in which they experienced the absence of the world's objects and experienced happiness within that absence. An experience of absence is not the same as the absence of experience. Something was being experienced, a thick, enveloping, peaceful nothingness. That nothingness is not a logical vacuum. It is the seed state of the world. The compressed form of avidya before it unfolds into the forms of space and time and multiplicity. Avidya operates through two distinct powers, and it is essential to hold them apart. The first is the veiling power Avarana Shakti. This is the function by which avidya conceals the nature of Brahman from the individual. It does not destroy Brahman or alter it in any way. It simply makes the infinite appear as though it is not there, creating the felt sense of not knowing, limitation, and separateness. The second is the projecting power Viksepa Shakti. Once the truth is hidden, this power goes to work. It is the dream architect. Using the concealed being of Brahman as its raw material, the projecting power throws out the forms of name and form, namarupa, as the content of the experienced world. The world is not Brahman transformed. It is avidya projected upon Brahman, the way a film is projected onto a screen. The screen does not become the film. The film appears on the screen. Where does avidya reside? This is one of the most technically contested questions in Advaita, and Madhusudana addresses it with care. Avidya's locus is Brahman. It rests in the infinite ground, but its object, the thing it conceals and distorts, is also Brahman. This is not a paradox, but a structural necessity. Only a real substratum can support even a false appearance. Brahman, being pure awareness, is never actually obscured by the avidya that rests in it, just as the sky is not actually touched by the clouds that appear in it. It is the reflected consciousness, the individual soul, the jiva, that suffers the distortion. The cataract rests in the eye but does not blind the light. It blinds the seeing of the eye that houses it. Is avidya itself real? Here Madhusudana applies the same criterion established in Phase 2. Avidya is sublatable. It is removed by the knowledge of Brahman. Anything removable by knowledge was not absolutely real. Yet anything that produces the experience of a rope snake, the felt terror and the racing heart, cannot be called absolutely unreal. Avidya is therefore mithya in precisely the sense already defined, a positive functioning reality that is neither ultimately existent nor utterly non-existent. It is a logic gate that exists only as long as you are looking through it. When you see the one who installed the gate and its architecture dissolve together. Phase 6. The witness and the reflection. This phase addresses a view that appears within the Advaita Siddhi as one among several epistemological positions Madhusudana considers. It is sometimes called Drishti Srishti Vada, the view that perception and creation are simultaneous, that the world arises in the act of being seen. Madhusudana deploys this view as a valid tool of analysis in certain contexts, particularly when pressing the argument against external realism. But it is important to understand what he is doing. He is not declaring this to be the Advaita Siddhi's single settled metaphysical commitment. He is showing that even on the most demanding epistemological hypothesis, even granting that there is no independently existing external world waiting to be discovered, the Advaita position holds. The strength of the argument lies in its generality. The conclusions survive across multiple epistemological starting points. With that in mind, here is what the view says and why it is useful. On this hypothesis, the being of a perceived object is inseparable from its being perceived. There is no gap between cognition and creation. When awareness opens onto an object, the object as an experienced phenomenon comes into being in that very act. When awareness closes, the phenomenon is dissolved. This does not mean that a wise person's body vanishes the moment someone stops looking at it. It means something more careful, that the world, as a totality of experienced objects, has no existence independent of the awareness in which it appears. It is not that individual perceivers conjure their own private universes. It is that the entire display rests on the single ground of awareness rather than on some separate, independently existing matter. If the world has no ground outside awareness, who or what is doing the awareness? We identify the witness Sakshi. The witness is the changeless luminosity that illuminates all states equally, the content of waking, the dissolution of deep sleep, the chaos of dream. It does not create the world through effort or desire. It does not deliberate or project. Its presence is the precondition for anything at all to appear. It is like a lamp that does not choose what it lights. The lamp simply burns, and whatever is in the room is revealed. The dualist asks, if I am this witness, why do I feel like a small and limited person? The answer uses the image of a face and its reflection. Brahman is the original face. The mind is a mirror. The individual is the reflection of the face in the mirror. The reflection appears to have all the features of the original eyes, expression, presence, but the reflection has no life independent of the original and no substance independent of the mirror. The tragedy is not that the reflection exists. The tragedy is when the reflection forgets the original and spends its energy trying to improve itself, not realizing that its only reality is the face outside the glass. By tracing the world back to awareness as its necessary ground, we have undermined the picture of a universe that exists outside and independently of the self, and that the self must navigate as a small creature in a large machine. The mountain is heavy and the ocean is deep, but when the source of their being is understood, the weight of existence is distributed differently. We are not creatures inside a world. We are the awareness in which a world appears. Phase 7. The validity of the light. The skeptic stands at the ramparts with a challenge that cuts at the roots of the entire enterprise. How do you know that your knowledge of Brahman is valid? You claim the Upanishadic sentence delivers the truth. But who validates the validation? If knowledge requires a separate test to confirm it, then the test requires its own test, and you have begun an infinite regress. If knowledge does not require a separate test, then you have admitted that some knowledge is self-certifying. And if that is true for ordinary knowledge, why not also for the dualist's knowledge of a real world? The Advaita Siddhi's answer is that validity, pramanya, is intrinsic to knowledge. It arises with the knowledge itself and does not wait to be conferred by a subsequent act of verification. This position is stated in direct opposition to the Mimamsaka and Nyaya schools, which hold different views about how validity is generated and confirmed, and Madhusudana engages those schools explicitly. The argument proceeds as follows. Knowledge has two aspects. It reveals an object, and it does so with the implicit claim of being a correct revelation. These two aspects are not separate events. When you see a lamp in a room, the lamp reveals the table, the chair, the walls. The lamp does not need a second lamp to prove that it is functioning as a lamp. Its functioning is self-evident in the revealing itself. So it is with awareness. Knowledge reveals its object and simultaneously presents itself as a revelation. If this self-evidence were not built in, then to trust any piece of knowledge you would need a second piece of knowledge to verify the first, and a third to verify the second, and you would never arrive at a single confident cognition. The fact that ordinary practical life proceeds at all, that a person can reach for a cup of water and find it, is evidence that knowledge does not in practice require external validation before it is trusted. The implicit self-evidence is what makes action possible. The objection is immediate. If all knowledge is intrinsically valid, then even the mirage knowledge, the perception of water where there is only sand, is valid, and then how does error exist at all? The Advaita answer is precise. Knowledge is intrinsically valid in its origination. Error enters not through the knowledge itself, but through a defect in the instrument of knowing, a misalignment of the sense organ, a distortion introduced by distance or bad light, an interference from prior mental impressions. The mirage knowledge arises valid, and it is subsequently cancelled by the stronger knowledge of the dry sand. The cancellation comes from a defect being corrected, not from the original knowledge being shown to lack intrinsic validity. Now the critical application. The Upanishadic sentence, that thou art, is a piece of verbal knowledge arising from a source. What defects could compromise it? The defects that compromise ordinary perceptual knowledge are defects in the sense organs and their conditions. The defects that compromise inferential knowledge are defects in the invariable concomitants underlying the inference. Verbal knowledge depends on the reliability of the speaker and the accuracy of the words. The Upanishads are held, in the Advaita tradition, to be a pramana, a source of valid cognition, precisely because they are not the product of any individual speaker with personal interests and individual cognitive limitations. They report the nature of Brahman from the standpoint of Brahman itself. There is no defect to introduce error. And crucially, there is no subsequent experience that can sublate the realization of non-duality, because any subsequent experience, any experience whatsoever, occurs within the awareness that is Brahman. The ground cannot be cancelled by what appears on the ground. The sun cannot be extinguished by a shadow. The validity of the great sentence is absolute because there is nothing outside it from which a corrective strike could be launched. Phase 8. The logic of the great sentence. The Advaita Siddhi's treatment of the mahavakya, the great sentence Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, is among its most technically detailed sections. Madhusudana engages here not only the standard Advaita account of sentence meaning, but also the specific objections raised by Mimamsaka interpreters concerning samanadhikaranya, the grammatical relation of co-reference, and the objections raised by Nyayika logicians concerning the conditions under which two terms can be said to refer to a single substance. These debates matter because the mahavakya is the sentence on which the entire practical project of Advaita, the transformation of the hearer, depends. If the sentence cannot be defended as a coherent claim to identity, the philosophy has no linguistic vehicle. The surface-level objection is the starting point. Tat, that in ordinary usage refers to Ishvara, the Lord, who is characterized by omniscience, omnipotence, the role of cosmic creator, and complete independence. Tvam, thou, refers to the individual soul, characterized by limited knowledge, dependence, smallness, and the role of a creature subject to action and its consequences. These two terms pick out entities with flatly contradictory qualifications. To say they are identical looks like saying fire is water. If the sentence is taken at its literal meaning, its primary denotative reference, it appears self-contradictory. This is the objection that must be met. The Advaita response appeals to a specialized mode of sentence meaning called jahadajaholakshana, which may be translated as partial exclusion. This is one of the recognized modes of secondary meaning in the Indian linguistic tradition. The principle is that when the literal meaning of a sentence generates a contradiction, the listener is licensed to look for a secondary meaning that resolves the contradiction by partially excluding or setting aside certain features of the literal meaning while retaining others. Applied to the mahavakya, from the term tat, we exclude the external qualifications, omniscience, creatorship, the relation to the cosmos, while retaining the inner essence, which is pure awareness. From the term tvam, we exclude the external qualifications, embodiment, smallness, limitation, while retaining the inner essence, which is also pure awareness. What remains on both sides, once the mutually contradictory outer garments have been set aside, is the identical mass of awareness, chidgana, that admits of no internal division. The identity the sentence declares is not an identity between a powerful king and a helpless subject. It is an identity between the same substance, as it appears in two different configurations of ignorance-generated qualification. Madhusudana is careful to specify what kind of identity this is. It is not the identity expressed in a sentence like the lotus is blue, where a property is predicated of a subject. That is a relational sentence. The Mahavakya expresses akhandathatva, the indivisible meaning, in which there is no predicating and no subject of predication. There is only the pointing of two terms to a single undivided reality. The classic illustration is the statement, this is that devadatta. When you see a man today in the forest whom you once met years ago in the city, the word that points to the city context and the word this points to the forest context. The sentence you utter does not assert a relation between two different people. It collapses both contexts to identify the single person who persists through both. The city and the forest, the past and the present, are deleted from the meaning to leave the uncontextualized person. So it is with Tat and Tvam. The cosmic coordinate and the individual coordinate are deleted, and what remains is the uncontextualized awareness that was always the only thing either word was pointing toward. The Mimamsaka objection to Samanadhikaranya, co-reference, is that two terms genuinely co-refer only when they pick out the same locus of the same individual property. On the Mimamsaka analysis, Tat and Tvam do not pick out the same locus, because the Lord and the individual are genuinely distinct loci with genuinely distinct properties. Therefore, the grammatical form of the sentence misleads. Madhusudana's response is that the Mimamsaka analysis assumes a framework in which properties are real and loci are independent, precisely the framework the Advaita Siddhi has been systematically dismantling from phase 2 onward. Once the independence of loci and the ultimate reality of qualificatory difference have been shown to be mithya, the Mimamsaka objection has no ground to stand on. It is an objection internal to a framework that has already been shown to be a superimposition. The Nayayika objects along similar lines. Genuine identity requires that the two things said to be identical share all their properties, and since Ishvara and the Jiva do not share all properties, one is omniscient and one is not, the identity claim fails. Madhusudana's answer is again that the Nayayika analysis applies to identities between empirical entities with genuinely independent property bundles. Brahman is not an entity with a property bundle. Brahman is the ground that makes property bundles possible. The Nayayika framework, like the Mimamsaka one, is an analysis of the world within the appearance, not of the ground of the appearance itself. As long as the listener is operating inside that framework, the mahavakya looks like a grammatical confusion. Once the listener understands what has been established in the earlier phases of the argument, the mahavakya is recognized as the most precise statement possible of the most fundamental fact. This is why Madhusudana insists that the mahavakya is not a metaphor, not a pious sentiment, and not an invitation to meditate on unity as an aspiration. It is a linguistic act with the precision of a surgical instrument. It removes, in a single stroke, both the distance that made God seem remote and the boundary that made the self seem small. What remains, when those two superimpositions are lifted, is not a union of previously separate things. It is the recognition of what was never divided. Phase 9. The refutation of the real. The dualist launches a volley of common sense. How can you call the world false when it is so obviously useful? Water quenches thirst. Fire cooks food. The ground supports the feet. Bridges hold weight. Medicine heals disease. If the world were like a mirage, it would have no functional power. Since the world demonstrably works, it must be real. Utility is the proof of reality. You are confusing function with ontological status. Utility is not the certificate of ultimate truth. In the laboratory of careful analysis, we distinguish between the absolutely real, that which is never sublated by any subsequent experience, and the empirically operative, that which functions reliably within a given framework of experience, while remaining, in principle, sublatable when that framework is transcended. Consider a man in deep dream who is dying of thirst. He finds a lake. He drinks the water. His thirst is quenched and he feels genuine relief. While he is in the dream, the water performs its function perfectly. It operates exactly as water operates. When he wakes, does he find his throat wet? No. The function was real within the parameters of the dream. It did not survive the sublation of the dream framework. the world is a collective and persistent dream. Its water quenches thirst, and its fire burns skin, but only within the operative framework of Maya. The fact that the operations are perfectly consistent within the framework does not establish that the framework is the final one. It establishes only that the framework is internally coherent, which is exactly what we expect from a well-constructed appearance. The skeptic presses, but I feel the world's existence pressing on me in every atom. Where does that dense feeling of existence come from if the world is false? The answer returns to what was established in Phase 3. The world is inert name and form. The existence, the isness, it seems to carry, is not its own property. It is Brahman shining through the structure of the appearance, the way a block of dark stone placed in a furnace begins to glow red. The child who sees the glowing stone says the stone is producing light. The trained observer says the stone has no light of its own. Remove it from the furnace, and it returns to cold darkness. The existence you feel in the world is Brahman's existence, felt through the medium of the world's forms. Remove Brahman and the world does not become dark. It ceases to be even a shadow. Why does this philosophical distinction matter practically? Because the world's apparent absolute reality is the very source of bondage. If the world is as ultimately real as Brahman, then your subjection to it is permanent. It can impose its terms on you unconditionally and forever. The demonstration that the world is sublatable is not a consolation for philosophers. It is the logical key that makes liberation conceivable. If the appearance can be dissolved by knowledge, then knowledge is the exit. The exit exists. The prisoner is not permanently enclosed. Phase 10. The process of negation. The skeptic asks, you say knowledge destroys ignorance and thereby dissolves the world. But if the world is a physical mass, how does a thought dissolve it? You are proposing that a mental event cancels a material reality. That seems absurd. Can thinking about a fire put it out? The misunderstanding here is about what is being negated and how. Knowledge does not act as a hammer to break apart the elements of the world. Knowledge acts as a solvent that dissolves the superimposition, the false identification of the appearance as an independently real substance. The Sanskrit term is b'adh as sublation. Sublation is not destruction of matter. It is the recognition that what appeared to have independent existence never had it. The snake in the rope is not destroyed. It is sublated, recognized as never having been there. The structure of sublation requires attention. When the rope is recognized, the snake does not migrate to another location. It simply ceases to be presented as an objective reality. The rope remains exactly as it was. What disappears is the snake overlay. This is the model for what knowledge does to the world. The world as appearance does not disappear from the visual field of the liberated sage. What disappears is its presentation as an independently real substance separate from Brahman. The pure being that was always there, Brahman, remains exactly as it was. What is sublated is the ignorance-generated overlay that made it look like a world of separate, independently existing things. How does the recognition I am Brahman accomplish this? Ignorance is the material cause of the world superimposition. Knowledge is the direct antagonist of ignorance. They cannot coexist. When the light of clear knowledge strikes, it does not attack the world directly. It eliminates the cause. And when a cause is eliminated, the effect produced by that cause cannot stand independently. The superimposed world, deprived of the ignorance that was projecting it, is recognized as what it always was, an appearance in Brahman with no being of its own. The dualist objects, if the world was never really there, then my entire experience of it was a delusion. Does this make me a madman? No, a madman's perceptions are privately generated and cannot be shared. The world appearance is a consistent and communicable framework arising from a common ignorance. The error is not in the perceiving. The world as appearance is genuinely perceived. The error is in the identification, seeing the appearance and concluding that it is an independently real substance rather than Brahmans being appearing in this form. The correction is not the removal of experience, but the correction of the metaphysical interpretation imposed on experience. The cracked mirror still shows a face after you have understood the crack is in the mirror. The understanding does not remove the image. It removes the false interpretation of the image as a wound. And here is what Madhusudana identifies as the most ruthless precision of the analysis. When sublation occurs, it does not merely show that the world is false now. It reveals that the world was never an independent substance, not in the past, not in the present, not in the future. The correction is 3/10. The prisoner is freed not just from the present sentence, but from the belief that the sentence was ever legitimately imposed. Phase 11. The Sovereign Survivor. The dualist makes one last attempt. If your knowledge has truly eliminated ignorance, and ignorance was the material cause of the body and the world, then the body should have dissolved at the moment of realization. If you are still here, walking and talking, then the ignorance is still operating, which means the knowledge was not complete. A liberated sage who still has a body is a contradiction. The response distinguishes between two different relations a living being can have to ignorance-produced effects. The first is the causal relation, ignorance, as the ongoing cause that sustains the world superimposition in its projective function. The second is the inertial relation, the specific configuration of past action, prarabdha karma, that gave rise to this particular birth and this particular body. Knowledge dissolves the first. It does not retroactively annul the second, for the same reason that understanding a mirage does not retroactively untravel the miles you walked toward it. Madhusudana uses the analogy of the three grades of stored action. The first is the accumulated store of past deeds, the granary, which would have produced future births and future configurations of the world appearance. Knowledge incinerates this store completely. A burnt seed does not germinate. No future birth is generated from the post-realization moment. The second is the actions performed after awakening, the newly sown seeds. These do not adhere to the sage, because the ego that would be the locus of their ownership has been recognized as a superimposition. Action performed without a real locus of identification does not generate binding momentum. The third is the prarabdha, the arrow already in flight, the specific karma that launched this particular life and this particular body. Once an arrow has left the bow, the archer cannot call it back even by understanding that the target was a mistake. The body is that arrow. Its momentum must play out. The sage inhabits the body as a traveler inhabits a rented room, present, using what is provided, but not building a permanent home. What does the sage experience in this state, jivan mukti, liberation while living? Madhusudana is careful here. To the observer, the sage eats, moves, responds, and speaks. These events occur. But the sage's relationship to these events is not the relationship of an agent who claims them as expressions of a self. Action requires a locus of identification. The sage has recognized that the I is neither the body, the mind, nor the chain of their operations. When the hands move, the awareness in which the movement occurs is not itself moving. It is the way space is not moved when a pot moves through it. The sage is the space. The body is the pot. The appearance of personality and particularity continues. The sage still has a name, a history, a way of speaking. These are what they always were, appearances in awareness. The difference is that the sage no longer mistakes these appearances for the ground of identity. When the momentum of the arrow finally reaches zero, the state Advaita calls Vidhamukti, liberation upon the dissolution of the body. The appearance of a separate individual dissolves back into the source. The way a wave, when it runs out of momentum, is recognized as never having been anything but the ocean itself. Phase 12, the final seal. The tournament of logic has concluded. Standing back and surveying what has been established, falsity was defined in 5 precise technical formulations, and the world was shown to satisfy all of them. Difference was demonstrated to be self-undermining as a logical concept, generating either a circular dependency or an infinite regress at every point of pressure. Knowledge was shown to be intrinsically valid, with the Upanishadic report carrying a validity that no subsequent experience can cancel. The mahavakya was demonstrated to be a coherent and precise identity statement once the correct mode of sentence meaning is applied, and the standard objections from Mimamsaka and Nyayika sources are answered. The world was shown to be empirically operative, but ultimately sublatable. Sublation was explained as the dissolution of a superimposition, not the destruction of matter. The liberated sage was shown to be a coherent possibility, not a contradiction. Madhusudana delivers the final crystallization of the entire argument. If Brahman is the only reality and Brahman is without change, then the world did not begin. It did not emerge from something else. It did not transform Brahman into a different substance. It appeared, the way the snake appears in the rope, without altering the substrate for even a moment. The siege was a hallucination. The enemy standing outside the fortress was a phantom. You were never in danger, because there was never anything outside to threaten you. The skeptic asks the last question: if there is only one, why does the theater of the many appear at all? Why this extraordinary complex display? Madhusudana does not attempt to give a causal account of why ignorance exists. That question, pressed far enough, always returns the answer. Ignorance exists because ignorance exists, and when knowledge rises, the question loses its urgency, the way a dreamer's dream questions lose their urgency upon waking. What the Advaita Siddhi provides is not an explanation of why the many appears, but a precise demonstration of what the many is. Brahman appearing through the lens of avidya, the way gold appears as a ring without ceasing to be gold. Logic is a tool of the mind. The mind is a mirror. Throughout this argument, the mirror has been used to see the face, but the final precision of the whole project is this: when the face is clearly recognized, the mirror is no longer needed. Even the knowledge of non-duality is, technically, a modification of the mind. It is the final thought, the thought that cancels the thought of duality. And once it has performed that cancellation, it too becomes unnecessary. The way a medicinal herb, once it has cleared the disease, is metabolized and leaves the body. What remains is not a theory held in the mind. What remains is the being that was always there before the theory was needed. A note on the ending of the source text that was used to prepare this recording. The final section of that source drew not only on the Advaita Siddhi, but also synthesized material from Shankaracharya and Dharmaraja Advarindra, two other major voices in the Advaita tradition, without clearly marking where Madhusudana's text ends and the editorial synthesis begins. That synthesis has not been carried forward here. What you have heard is an attempt to stay within what the Advaita Siddhi itself argues, presented in plain language, and without misattributing to this one text what properly belongs to the broader conversation of the tradition. Madhusudana closes with the words that the entire argument has been building toward. They are not a flourish. They are the logical residue after everything that was not fundamental has been stripped away. Brahman is truth, the world is false, the soul is Brahman alone. The tournament is over. The silence that remains is not empty. It is the only thing that was ever here.